She walked into the bank that morning like anyone else, calm, confident, and with a purpose. But the moment her skin tone caught the manager's eye, the atmosphere shifted. Whispers followed her steps, glances turned sharp, and unease filled the air. Within moments, a quiet transaction turned into chaos. They said her ID looked fake. They said her presence felt off. And before she knew it, the manager was on the phone, calling the FBI on a woman who only wanted to cash her own check. Flashing lights soon reflected off the glass doors. Agents rushed in, surrounding her. But she didn't panic. She didn't plead. Because this time, they had no idea who they were dealing with. What no one in that bank realized was that the woman they tried to humiliate was one of them. And when she finally showed her badge, the entire room fell silent. This is the moment justice flipped the script. But tell me, where are you watching this from right now? Hit subscribe for more real stories that uncover the truth. Her name was Danielle Moore, a 34-year-old federal agent who had worked her way up from nothing. The daughter of a single mother, she grew up in the South, where opportunities were rare and judgment came easy. But Danielle was determined, driven by discipline, excellence, and a quiet promise to herself: no one would ever define her by her skin. Every morning, she followed the same routine: coffee, a quick jog, then straight to her field office downtown. Her colleagues knew her as calm, precise, and professional, the kind of person who could walk into chaos and bring order without raising her voice. She'd earned respect, though few ever guessed the walls she'd had to climb to get there. That Friday morning was supposed to be simple. She'd taken a personal day, planning to handle errands she'd been putting off for weeks. The last stop on her list was the local bank, a place she'd visited several times before without issue. Dressed neatly in her blazer and holding a folder of official documents, Danielle expected to be in and out in minutes. But the moment she stepped through those glass doors, something felt different. The smiles at the counter were tight. Conversations seemed to pause mid-sentence. A man in a suit, later identified as the branch manager, watched her every move as she approached the desk. Still, Danielle stayed composed. She'd been here before, in rooms where people questioned her worth, her identity, her right to simply exist. So she did what she always did: spoke clearly, handed over her paperwork, and waited. But as the teller's expression shifted from confusion to suspicion, Danielle sensed it, the invisible line being drawn between who they thought she was and who she really was. The soft murmur of voices behind the counter grew louder. Someone picked up the phone. Her name was being repeated, her documents passed around. Danielle tried to brush it off. Maybe it was a misunderstanding. Maybe. But deep down, she felt that old familiar tightening in her chest, the one that came whenever the world decided to see her as a threat instead of a person. She didn't know it yet, but within 15 minutes, she'd go from being a customer to a suspect, and then to something far greater. Because when truth finally walks into a room full of prejudice, it doesn't whisper. It commands silence. The ticking clock on the bank's wall seemed louder now. Danielle could feel every second stretch, heavy and deliberate. The teller's polite smile had vanished, replaced by a nervous stiffness. Her ID sat on the counter, untouched for far too long. The man in the suit, the branch manager, leaned closer, whispering to the teller while glancing her way. Their eyes didn't carry curiosity. They carried doubt. "Is there a problem?" Danielle asked calmly, her voice measured. The teller flinched at the sound, as if caught doing something wrong. "No, she stammered, "we just need to verify a few details." But the tone said otherwise. Danielle had heard that tone before, the one that meant you don't belong here. Minutes dragged on. 2 employees walked into the back room, one clutching a phone. The other peeked through the blinds toward the parking lot. A security guard shifted his stance, his hand hovering near his radio. Danielle's instincts, the same ones that had kept her alive through countless operations, started to flare. Something wasn't right. She kept her composure. Years of law enforcement training taught her that panic feeds prejudice. So she waited, silent but alert. Then, through the reflection on the counter, she caught it, A quick glimpse of the manager whispering into the receiver, glancing at her again and again. A chill rippled down her spine. They weren't verifying anything. They were reporting her. Moments later, she saw it, the flashing red and blue lights cutting across the bank's glass front. Sirens muted but unmistakable. Patrons turned their heads, some whispering, others pulling out phones. Danielle's heart pounded, not from guilt, but disbelief. The manager stepped back, a look of manufactured concern plastered on his face. "Please, stay calm," he said, his voice trembling in mock reassurance. "There's been a situation." A situation. That's what they called it. A black woman cashing her own check had become a situation. The doors burst open. Agents in tactical gear stormed in, their weapons drawn low but ready. The customers screamed, diving for cover. And there she stood, hands visible, posture steady, as half a dozen armed men surrounded her like she was a threat. Step away from the counter," one agent barked. Danielle didn't move. Her badge was still in her bag, tucked under the documents they had refused to look at. She could end this in seconds, but she didn't. Not yet. Because right now, she wanted to see how far they'd go. The agents exchanged glances, unsure why the woman in front of them wasn't panicking. One moved closer, grabbing her arm. That's when she finally spoke, calm, firm, unshaken. "Do you know who you just called?" The question hung in the air like a spark waiting to ignite. The manager frowned, confused. "We called the FBI," he said proudly, as if it justified everything. Danielle's lips curved slightly, not in a smile but in the kind of restrained disbelief that comes from seeing ignorance unfold in real time. "Good," she said quietly. "Then you called my office." The words landed like thunder, but they didn't understand, not yet. One of the agents glanced at her bag, noticing the familiar insignia peeking from inside. His posture shifted. Confusion. Recognition. Then shock. Within moments, the tone in the room changed. The manager's confidence began to crack. The agents lowered their weapons slowly, exchanging looks of regret and realization. But Danielle's eyes stayed on the man behind the counter, the one who had started it all. Even then, he refused to meet her gaze. His face turned pale, hands trembling, but his pride kept him silent. Danielle didn't shout. She didn't scold. She just stood there, a living contradiction to every stereotype that had fueled their fear. And for the first time, the silence in that room wasn't born of suspicion, it was born of shame. But this wasn't over. Not yet. Because while the agents were starting to understand, the world outside was about to learn what really happens when justice walks through the door they tried to close. Something was shifting, and the fallout was only just beginning. For a moment, no one spoke. The entire bank seemed to freeze, time stretching between disbelief and realization. The agents, seconds ago ready to detain her, now stood in stunned silence as Danielle slowly reached into her bag and pulled out her identification wallet. The gold badge caught the fluorescent light, gleaming like a mirror to their mistakes. The seal of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Her name, clear and unshakable, Special Agent Danielle Moore. Gasps echoed through the room. The same teller who had refused to look her in the eye now stood paralyzed, lips parted but words refusing to form. The manager stumbled back, color draining from his face. I didn't know," he stammered. Danielle's voice cut through the air, steady, cold, and filled with a weight that only truth could carry. "You didn't ask to know," she said. "You assumed." When Danielle stepped out of that bank, the world outside felt colder, but clearer. The crowd that had gathered parted in silence as she passed, their faces a blur of guilt, awe, and quiet realization. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The truth had already spoken louder than anything she could say. That night, headlines began to spread. FBI agent wrongly detained after bank calls federal authorities on her. The story hit every major outlet within hours. Social media erupted. Some called it another misunderstanding. Others called it what it was, a mirror reflecting everything people tried to deny. Inside her apartment, Danielle sat alone at her kitchen table, her badge resting beside her untouched dinner. It gleamed under the light, but it no longer felt like power. It felt like proof that even the highest title couldn't shield her from the prejudice baked into people's perceptions. She thought about the countless names that never made the news. The men and women who didn't have a badge to flash. The ones who were humiliated, handcuffed, or worse, simply because they fit a description. In that moment, she realized her silence wasn't an option anymore. The next morning, she filed a formal report, not out of anger, but responsibility. She spoke to the media, not for revenge but for change. If this can happen to me, she said, then imagine what happens to those who can't prove who they are. Her words struck deep. Protests formed outside the bank within days. The manager was placed on leave. But Danielle didn't celebrate. This wasn't victory, it was exposure. A single spotlight in a much darker room. Weeks later, she returned to her office. Her colleagues greeted her differently now, some with empathy, others with discomfort. But Danielle didn't carry resentment. She carried purpose. She'd become more than an agent, she was now a living reminder of the very injustice she'd sworn to fight. Sometimes, she still passed that same bank on her way to work. The glass doors were the same, but to her, they looked different now, like a reflection of a system still cracked, still healing. She'd stop for a moment, watching people walk in and out. Some glanced her way, some didn't. And she'd wonder how many of them had learnt something that day. Because this wasn't just about a woman in a bank. It was about every person who's been doubted, dismissed, or dehumanized because of the color of their skin. Danielle's story was just one, but it carried the weight of millions. Injustice doesn't always scream. Sometimes, it whispers through policies, stays, and silence. The question is, will we keep pretending not to hear it? If this story moved you, share it. Speak up. Because silence only protects the system, not the people it hurts. Where are you watching from tonight, and how many more stories like this need to happen before change finally begins?